Hey guys, Lord Naren White here, the Holy Ghost, the one true God. Back with you with the next video in my series reading Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. Without further ado, returning to Oliver Twist as read by Lord Naren White. Though I must say, continued the undertaker, resuming the current of observations which the beadle had interrupted. Though I must say, Mr. Bumble, that I have to contend against one very great disadvantage, which is that all the stout people go off the quickest. The people who have been better off, and have paid rates for many years, are the first to sink when they come into the house. And, let me tell you, Mr. Bumble, that 3 or 4 inches over one's calculation makes a great hole in one's profits, especially when one has a family to provide for, sir. As Mr. Sowerberry said this, with the becoming indignation of an ill-used man, and as Mr. Bumble felt that it rather tended to convey a reflection on the honor of the parish, the latter gentleman thought it advisable to change the subject. Oliver Twist being uppermost in his mind, he made him his theme. By the by, said Mr. Bumble, you don't know anybody who wants a boy, do you? A parochial prentice who is at present a dead weight, a millstone, as I may say, round the parochial throat. Liberal terms, Mr. Sowerberry, liberal terms. As Mr. Bumble spoke, he raised his cane to the bill above him, and gave 3 distinct raps upon the words, £5, which were printed thereon in Roman capitals of gigantic size. Gadso, said the undertaker, taking Mr. Bumble by the gilt-edged lapel of his official coat. That's just the very thing I wanted to speak to you about. You know, dear me, what a very elegant button this is, Mr. Bumble. I never noticed it before. Yes, I think it rather pretty, said the beadle, glancing proudly downstairs at the large brass buttons which embellished his coat. The die is the same as the parochial seal, the Good Samaritan healing the sick and bruised man. The board presented it to me on New Year's morning, Mr. Sowerberry. I put it on, I remember for the first time, to attend the inquest on that reduced tradesman, who died in a doorway at midnight. I recollect, said the undertaker. The jury brought it in. Died from exposure to the cold, and want of the common necessaries of life, didn't they? Mr. Bumble nodded. And they made it a special verdict, I think, said the undertaker, by adding some words to the effect that if the relieving officer had— Tush, foolery, interposed the beadle. If the board attended to all the nonsense that ignorant jurymen talk, they'd have enough to do. Very true, said the undertaker. They would indeed. Juries, said Mr. Bumble, grasping his cane tightly, as was his wont when working into a passion. Juries is ineducated, vulgar, grovelling wretches. So they are, said the undertaker. They haven't no more philosophy nor political economy about 'em than that, said the beadle, snapping his fingers contemptuously. No more they have, acquiesced the undertaker. I despise 'em, said the beadle, growing very red in the face. So do I, rejoined the undertaker, and I only wish we'd a jury of the independent sort in the house for a week or 2, said the beadle. The rules and regulations of the board would soon bring their spirit down for him. Let him alone for that, replied the undertaker. So saying, he smiled approvingly to calm the rising wrath of the indignant parish officer. Mr. Bumble lifted off his cocked hat, took a handkerchief from the inside of the crown, wiped from his forehead the perspiration which his rage had engendered, fixed the cocked hat on again, and, turning to the undertaker, said in a calmer voice, Well, what about the boy? Oh, replied the undertaker. Why, you know, Mr. Bumble, I pay a good deal toward the poor's rates. Hem, said Mr. Bumble. Well, well, replied the undertaker. I was thinking that if I pay so much towards him, I've a right to get as much out of him as I can, Mr. Bumble, and so I think I'll take the boy myself. Mr. Bumble grasped the undertaker by the arm and led him into the building. Mr. Sowerberry was closeted with the board for 5 minutes, and it was arranged that Oliver should go to him that evening, upon liking, a phrase which means, in case of a parish apprentice, that if the master find, upon a short trial, that he can get enough work out of a boy without putting too much food into him, he shall have him for a term of years to do what he likes with. When little Oliver was taken before the gentleman that evening, and informed that he was to go that night as general house lad to a coffin's maker's, and that if he complained of his situation or ever came back to the parish again, he would be sent to sea, there to be drowned or knocked on the head, as the case might be, he evinced so little emotion that they by common consent pronounced him a hardened young rascal, and ordered Mr. Bumble to remove him forthwith. Now, although it was very natural that the board, of all the people in the world, should feel in a great state of virtuous astonishment, and horror at the smallest tokens of want of feeling on the part of anybody, they were rather out in this particular instance. The simple fact was that Oliver, instead of possessing too little feeling, possessed rather too much, and was in a fair way of being reduced for life to a state of brutal stupidity and sullenness by the ill usage he had received. He heard the news of his destination in perfect silence, and having had his luggage put into his hand, which was not very difficult to carry, inasmuch as it was all compromised within the limits of a brown paper parcel, about half a foot square by 3 inches deep, he pulled his cap over his eyes, and once more attaching himself to Mr. Bumble's coat cuff, was led away by that dignitary to a new scene of suffering. For some time Bumble drew Oliver along, without notice or remark, for the beetle carried his head very erect, as a beetle always should, and, it being a windy day, little Oliver was completely enshrouded by the skirts of Mr. Bramble's coat as they blew open, and disclosed to great advantage his flapped waistcoat, drab plush knee breeches. As they drew near to their destination, however, Mr. Bramble thought it expedient to look down, and see that the boy was in good order for inspection by his new master, which he accordingly did, with a fit and becoming air of gracious patronage. Oliver, said Mr. Bumble. Yes, sir, replied Oliver in a low, tremulous voice. Pull that cap off your eyes and hold your head up, sir. Although Oliver did as he was desired, at once, and passed the back of his unoccupied hand briskly across his eyes, he left a tear in them when he looked up at his conductor. As Mr. Bumble gazed sternly upon him, it rolled down his cheek. It was followed by another and another. The child made a strong effort, but it was an unsuccessful one. Withdrawing his other hand from Mr. Bumble's, he covered his face with both, and wept until the tears sprung out from between his chin and bony fingers. Well, exclaimed Mr. Bumble, stopping short, and darting at his little charge a look of intense malignity. Well, of all the ungratefullest and worst disposed boys as I ever see, Oliver, you are the... And we'll go ahead and stop there for this week. As usual, I want to say thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. Please like, comment, and subscribe
as it greatly helps the channel.
Light be with you all. Take care and thanks again.